Yeah.
Hello class, today Jenny and myself, my name is Amir,
My name is Jenny.
and we're going to be talking about prescription drugs. So we first want to start off by asking you, what are prescription drugs? Does anyone have any idea?
The ones the doctors give us.
Ones that doctors give us, great point. Does anyone know any examples of prescription drugs?
Vicodin.
Vicodin, okay, that's a good one. Xanax, perfect
Right.
too. So right, prescription drugs are medications prescribed by doctors. Aside from that, they're intended to treat specific symptoms when taken properly. So as you can see, we have just an example. We have some HIV medication that when taken properly is supposed to alleviate some of the symptoms that are associated with HIV. Now there's a common misconception that prescription drugs are legal, so they must be safer than illegal recreational drugs. However, just because it's legal doesn't always mean that it's safe. There are many risks to prescription drugs, one of which includes side effects. Now, I'm sure many of us have taken prescription drugs for common illnesses in the past, and you'll always see a little piece of paper that says common side effects, which may include headache, nausea, drowsiness. These are all very common for prescription drugs that anyone would take. However, aside from that, there's also overdose. Now, overdose is a lot more serious than these side effects that could often occur. And overdose would many times cause you to go to the hospital. You might need to get your stomach pumped, or oftentimes it could even lead to death. And last but not least, addiction is another very common risk that is associated with prescription drugs. Now, even when you take the drugs exactly the way a doctor prescribes it, it can sometimes even lead to addiction. Obviously, the risk is a lot higher when you do take a prescription drug, maybe not the same way that a doctor might prescribe. So the people who will crush up pills and try to snort them or take them in different ways that may not necessarily be how they were intended to be taken, put themselves at a higher risk for addiction.
There are many types of prescription drugs that can be abused and become addictive, and I'm going to talk about one special class called prescription opioids, and I'm going to use Vicodin and Oxycontin as specific drug examples. But first of all, has anybody seen the show House? Yeah. Okay, so if you haven't seen it, this guy, Dr. House, he is a very brilliant doctor, but he's also a Vicodin addict. And in the show, he's often depicted as very brilliant and really smart and very functional. However, for most Vicodin addicts, this is actually not true. For most Vicodin addicts, some of them will feel that the drug is consuming their lives and they become not very functional at all, which goes to show that Dr. House's addiction is very much glorified and that Hollywood is often not a very good place to look for information for drugs and addiction. So hopefully I'll be able to tell you some facts about these drugs. So the first drug I'll talk about is Vicodin. So Vicodin is a drug that is commonly, well not so commonly, but is usually prescribed by doctors whenever he or she thinks that you need it, and it's typically used for pain after surgery. It's actually a mixture of two different drugs. The first is called hydrocodone, and this is an opioid painkiller. We're going to talk a little bit more about this later. And the second drug is acetaminophen, and this is a non-opioid painkiller, and you may know it just as Tylenol. And another drug is called Oxycontin. This is just a name for the drug oxycodone, and like hydrocodone, this is also an opioid painkiller, and then doctors would prescribe it to you usually for pain related to cancer, heart attacks, severe burns, and bone pain. Okay, so I have mentioned the word opioid several times now, so what exactly are they? As we have said in the introduction, the brain uses chemicals and receptors to relay information and messages throughout the brain, and opioids are a type of these chemicals, and they're pictured here as these red little circles, and these can bind to these things, the receptors, and they're called the opioid receptors. And the opioid receptors are found in your brain, your spinal cord, as well as your gut. And whenever these opioids bind to their receptors, they can activate these receptors and reduce feelings of pain, which is why these drugs are so commonly used as painkillers. But it can also induce feelings of euphoria, or it's kind of like extreme happiness, which is one of the reasons why people would abuse these drugs. But in addition, they also cause many other effects that are often very, very undesirable. And some examples of opioids include hydrocodone, oxycodone, morphine, codeine, and heroin. And while drugs like hydrocodone and oxycodone are legal if your doctor prescribes it to you, drugs like heroin are illegal, even though these drugs all function very similarly. And to give you more of an idea of how these drugs work, our bodies actually naturally produce opioids, and one of these is called endorphins. And this is Elle Woods from Legally Blonde, and she explains it pretty well. Exercise gives you endorphins. Endorphins make you happy. Happy people don't shoot their husbands. They just don't. So, Vicodin, Oxycontin. There are many reasons and ways that you can abuse Vicodin and Oxycontin. The first, as I mentioned before, is to feel extremely happy or extremely relaxed. But some people also take it to relieve pain without a doctor's recommendation and prescription. For example, if you have a disorder that causes you pain on a day-to-day basis, you may take your friend's or someone else's Vicodin or Oxycontin prescription to help you with the pain, even though your doctor didn't recommend it. And it's actually illegal to sell Vicodin and Oxycontin to other people, and you can get a felony record for it, and you can go to prison as well. And then even if you actually get your own prescription of Oxycontin or Vicodin or any of these other drugs, and the bottle actually has your name on it, if you take these drugs without adhering to the doctor's orders, for example, if you decide to crush them up and store them, or if you decide to take these drugs more often than you should, this is also a form of abuse and can lead to addiction and many other undesirable effects. And there are a lot of undesirable effects of Vicodin and Oxycontin abuse, and here are just a few. For example, it can lead to confusion, nausea and vomiting, severe mood swings, fainting and loss of consciousness, seizures, and most dangerous of all, these drugs can slow your breathing and heartbeat, which can lead to death. And if you snorted or injected these drugs, this can be especially dangerous because it would increase the chances of you getting these undesirable side effects, as well as increasing the risks of addiction and overdose. And also, if you decide to mix these drugs with other drugs such as alcohol, this can be especially dangerous because alcohol is also a drug that can slow breathing and heartbeat. So, for example, if you took Vicodin and alcohol together, your breathing and heartbeat may become so slow that your chances of getting heart failure and death becomes increased. Both Vicodin and Oxycontin are very addictive drugs, and as I mentioned before, even if you took these drugs adhering to your doctor's orders, there's still a slight chance that you may become addicted. However, the chances of addiction become much greater with increased use and abuse. And after you take these drugs for a very long time and you stop using them, you can experience symptoms of withdrawal that can include irritability and agitation, muscle aches and pains, cramps, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and hot and cold sweats. And they're often very nasty. So if you or a friend needs help with Vicodin or Oxycontin or other forms of prescription opioid addiction, you can call a hotline 24 hours a day. And then there are also inpatient and outpatient rehabilitation programs that are there for you if you need them. I will give out more information about these in the pamphlets that will pass out after presentations. And my partner and me will also talk more about addiction treatment.
So as we mentioned, these are prescription drugs that are prescribed by doctors, right? You would think that they would be completely safe to use, but in reality they're not. Each drug is dose dependent, so each person is given a dose depending on what their symptoms are and how they could best alleviate them. So today, right now, I'm going to talk about Xanax. Xanax is a benzodiazepine. Can everyone say that with me? Benzodiazepine. So if you ever forget what a benzodiazepine does, just try to say it. It takes you so long to say, you have to say it very, very slowly, and that's exactly what it's doing to your brain. It really slows it down. Okay? Now, it's prescribed to treat panic disorder and serious anxiety. All right? So how does it work? Like I mentioned, it's a central nervous system depressant, so it'll really slow down the brain. Benzodiazepine, right? It makes the GABA neurotransmitter work better. Now we mentioned dopamine and serotonin. GABA is another neurotransmitter, but instead of having a more excitatory effect, it'll actually just have an inhibitory effect where it just slows down the brain instead of speeding up connections. So it produces a really drowsy and calming effect for the person that's using it. So this is an example of a synapse like we mentioned earlier, and this is before taking benzodiazepines. So as you can see, we have the neurotransmitters over here. The GABA neurotransmitters are still over here, nothing in the synapse really, and here's the GABA receptor over here. Once the benzodiazepine binds to the receptor, you can see that the neurotransmitter is released, and it has a specific effect where it's enhancing the effect of GABA within the synapse. Now, like I said, there are a lot of side effects when it comes to using benzodiazepines. But probably the most important ones, I think it got cut off a little bit. Most of them, the most common ones are unsteadiness or trembling, seizures. It's cut off on here too. Oh, it's cut off on here too. Okay, I'll fix that. There are 3 that are the most important that I'll be talking about.
Which might be the top.
Another really common issue is mixing with Xanax. So mixing Xanax with any other depressants, including alcohol, barbiturates, can be very, very deadly. And you'll often see that on the medications, it'll say do not drink alcoholic beverages when taking these drug medications. It might also say do not operate heavy machinery. These are very common to see. And there are various celebrities who have actually passed away from mixing Xanax with other depressants. For example, Heath Ledger, who's very commonly portrayed in the Batman movie, Whitney Houston, a very common singer, and Anna Nicole Smith, who is an actress. All 3 of these individuals have died from this.
What's a barbiturate?
That's a great question. So a barbiturate is another drug category that we're not going to go over today, but it is also just a central nervous system depressant. So like Xanax as a depressant, barbiturates just operate on different receptors, so it'll enhance the amount of GABA that's working to the point where you could completely stop breathing and you could die. Okay. Great question though. Withdrawal symptoms are also very important. So if you suddenly stop taking benzodiazepines, you could have a severe return of the anxiety, headaches, seizures, and nausea. Now seizures are the most important withdrawal symptom that I want to bring up, because withdrawal completely from benzodiazepines and alcohol could actually lead to death due to these seizures. And in terms of treatment plans, there are different rehab facilities and drug abuse counselors that could help. We also are passing out pamphlets with more information on treatment plans and phone numbers you could call that are completely confidential, anonymous. So if you or anyone you know is experiencing any difficulty with benzodiazepine or other prescription drug abuse, feel free to call that number. They'd be able to help you out. Okay? Thank you very much.